Today we've got the congressman for California's 28th district right here in LA, the chair of the House Intel Committee, and the author of the new book, Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could, Adam Schiff. Thanks for coming back on.
It's great to be with you.
So let's start off with the January 6th committee. The House has just voted in favor of this. So what does a full House vote in favor of holding Bannon in contempt mean? Like, what are the next steps here, and how will this process play out?
Well, I think it means, in its essence, that the rule of law is back, that no one's above the law. If you thwart a lawful subpoena, that you'll be prosecuted. It should be the same for everyone. I know if my constituents got a subpoena to appear in court or before Congress and just ignored it, they would be arrested and they would be prosecuted. It shouldn't be any different for Steve Bannon. So now that it's passed the House floor, it will go off to the Justice Department. The Justice Department has a duty to present it to the grand jury. It's not always the case that they do, but here I think there's good reason to be optimistic. I think the Attorney General understands that we have to validate the principle that no one's above the law, and we have to give meaning to compulsory process when Congress is doing its oversight. So I think it'll send a powerful message to others who might contemplate ignoring lawful process. And also Steve Bannon is a key witness, predicting the day before January 6th that all hell was going to break loose.
Well, speaking of the DOJ and some of the action that we've seen or lack thereof, aside from the committee itself, we do have the DOJ given the responsibility of taking action here against some of what we know are illegal offenses. Like, we have audio of Trump literally asking the Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes. Do you think that Merrick Garland should be more aggressive here? And I know this is a leading question, but isn't the failure to impose consequences just tacit permission to do it again?
I am deeply concerned that Donald Trump and others take away the message that you can't be prosecuted while you're the president of the United States. And when you leave the presidency, you can't be investigated or prosecuted. I understand, look, it's a difficult decision to potentially prosecute a former president, but I think you have to conduct the investigation. You have to find the facts, and then you make a decision about where the public interest lies. But we can't ignore what took place, and you point to Exhibit A, in my view, which is Donald Trump tried to get the Secretary of State in Georgia to commit a fraud, to declare that there were thousands and thousands of votes for him, Donald Trump, that didn't exist. I think if anyone else had done that, they would have been indicted by now. Now, it may be that the Justice Department is pursuing it. They're just keeping it a very good secret. But generally, when there are grand jury proceedings, they at least the existence of them makes its way into the public domain. So I am concerned that we not establish a precedent that a president is too big to fail and a president is too big to jail.
To speak on the fact that it's a difficult decision to move forward with prosecutions for people like Donald Trump, I don't think that it's any more difficult than it would be to contend with another January 6th.
Well, I agree. Right now, the former president is pushing the same big lie that led to the insurrection, and also working to try to get state legislatures around the country to strip independent elections officials of their duties, so that the next time they try to overturn an election and run into someone like Brad Raffensperger, who won't find 11,780 votes that don't exist, they will have in place somebody who will. I think we're on a very dangerous path to undermining the integrity of our elections, casting doubt on the whole process. And if people don't believe that their vote can be used to determine who governs and to decide disputes, then it leaves the country open to violence. And we saw that all too clearly on January 6th.
Now, do you imagine that Trump and Pence will, A, be called to testify for the January 6th committee, and B, comply with calls to testify if they are called?
I think all of us on the committee, Democrats and Republicans, are determined to get to the truth, and we will call anyone necessary to do so. So we haven't taken anybody off the table, including the former president or the former vice president. I'm not in a position to announce any decisions with regard to that. I think there's a lot of investigative work that we need to do before we reach that point. But our view is we want to write the definitive report. We want to shed light on this terrible tragedy, and we want to write recommendations that will help protect the country going forward, just like the 9/11 Commission did. And anyone who has relevant information that we need, we will go after.
Now, what are the range of outcomes in terms of consequences for some of the major players like Donald Trump, like Steve Bannon, or even the other congressmen who were alleged to have been involved in planning? And does the committee have any authority beyond recommending punishments to the DOJ? Can it actually, is there any enforcement mechanism?
There's no way to really enforce a prosecutorial decision. And so we are left to the discretion properly exercised by the Department of Justice. This is why, frankly, over the last 4 years, our system broke down. Bill Barr, when he was Attorney General, was not about to enforce the law against those lying to cover up for Donald Trump. Indeed, he was using the Department of Justice to intervene to reduce the sentence of one liar, Roger Stone, who was convicted of perjury, and to make the whole case go away against another liar, Michael Flynn, who lied to the FBI and pled guilty to it twice. Bill Barr was also someone, frankly, that we held in criminal contempt. And if he wasn't about to prosecute himself, and he wasn't going to prosecute others who were similarly covering up for the president. But it's a whole new ball game now, because we once again have a Justice Department devoted to justice and not the person or personal interests of the president.
Just going back to the previous question, the range of consequences for some of the major players, what, in terms of what the DOJ can do, what would we be looking at?
Well, I guess there are a couple of different parts to that. There's the question of what happens to people who don't cooperate when they're subpoenaed, and they here will face up to a year in jail and up to $100,000 in fines. For those that may be implicated in the insurrection itself, Congress doesn't have the power to prosecute them, but we do have the power to expose their role, their misconduct, whatever involvement they had. And that might help inform the Justice Department about whether a crime has been committed. We also have remedies in the House. We can bring people up on ethics charges. If their involvement was serious enough, we could even consider expulsion from the House. But the criminal remedy, the prosecutorial remedy, is not one that Congress enjoys.
Unfortunately, there's a feeling that I think a lot of us get that we won't actually see any accountability, and that, yet again, the same people who've committed crimes before in broad daylight with the whole world watching are going to get away with it now. So can you speak to that sense, and do you echo that same sense of futility, really?
Well, I can understand why people feel that way. And it was certainly a great frustration to me over the last several years that you had individual number one named in an indictment in the Southern District of New York, who it was clearly Donald Trump. And in that indictment, it says individual number one directed and coordinated a criminal scheme involving Michael Cohen. Well, the Justice Department argued that Michael Cohen had to go to jail because he was coordinated and directed. So what's the argument that the guy who did the directing and did the coordinating gets a pass? So I understand the frustration. It's a frustration that I share. And more than that, people watched witness after witness in the Russia and Ukraine investigation decide that they just were not going to cooperate. Now, we ended up impeaching Donald Trump for obstruction of Congress. But there didn't seem to be many repercussions for the actual people who did the individual obstructing. That's changed because we now, as I mentioned, have a Justice Department devoted to justice. But I certainly understand the frustration. I share it. And I view this contempt, this criminal contempt that we have voted on with Steve Bannon, to be an early test in terms of whether our democracy is recovering.
Has there been anything else that you've done within Congress to rectify some of the more egregious examples of corruption, from the internal side?
Yes. In fact, I talk about this in the book. I raised with the Speaker about a year and a half ago the need to have our own post-Watergate reforms, a whole series of measures designed to address the abuses of the last several years. So I introduced the Protecting Our Democracy Act. We hope to take it up as early as next month. And it would expedite congressional subpoenas. It would stiffen penalties for violating the Hatch Act and using the federal workforce as part of your campaign. It would provide an enforcement mechanism for the emoluments clause, so a president can't enrich themselves by having Gulf nations stay at his hotels and not even use the rooms. It would strengthen protections for inspector generals and whistleblowers, and a whole host of other reforms to protect the independence of the Justice Department. I view that as a key part of our democracy agenda, along with H.R. 1, as well as the Voting Rights Act.
Well, no, that's a great segue into exactly that, into voting rights, which I think is the most important. I mean, that's a foundational issue. So everything beyond that kind of relies on the fact that we get voting rights passed. What's the likelihood of a constitutional crisis occurring if Republicans take the House ahead of 2022 and then Trump decides to run in 2024, in your opinion?
Well, look, if Ken McCarthy were ever to step foot in the Speaker's office, it would mean essentially that Donald Trump was the Speaker, because Kevin McCarthy will not stand up to Donald Trump in any way, no matter how unethical the demand may be. If Kevin McCarthy had been Speaker after the last election, he would have decertified the results of the election. Someone with that little regard for our Constitution and oath of office can never be allowed to set foot in the Speaker's office. So it would be, I think, the path to the end of our democracy. It would pave the way for a return to Donald Trump. And who knows what the country would look like if we had to endure another 4 years of Donald Trump. So it's no exaggeration to say that in the midterms, our democracy will really be on the ballot. Now, I'm optimistic about those midterms. And I know people point to the historic trend in which the party in power in the White House loses seats in the congressional races. But that precedent depends on the fact that in the presidential election, the president sweeps into office a bunch of people from the same party. Well, Joe Biden didn't sweep into office a lot of House Democrats. In fact, House Democrats lost their seats in that presidential cycle. So we've already had our correction. And I feel optimistic about the midterms. We're going to have to work hard, particularly to overcome these efforts at disenfranchisement. But our folks are heavily motivated. Without Trump on the ballot, I think their folks are less motivated. And at the end of the day, it's going to be determined by who gets out to vote.
Now, I know you had mentioned before these Republicans targeting elections officials and replacing elections officials. Now, a lot of this happens at the state level. So is there anything that can be done federally to confront this issue? I know that, even within a bunch of the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, there are ways for us to confront a lot of the issues that we're facing. But with regard to these, that one issue of taking out independent elections workers and replacing them with partisan officials, because that's done so much at the state level, is there anything that can be done federally?
It's very hard. I think H.R. 1 and the John Lewis bill go some distance in trying to protect the country from those efforts at disenfranchisement and those efforts to essentially tee up overturning a legitimate election. But we also need to work at the state level. You're absolutely right. If they replace Brad Raffensperger with someone who's willing to do whatever Donald Trump tells him to do, there's only so much that can be done to protect against it. Now, were that situation to arise, were there a situation where Georgia, instead of sending a slate of electors that was chosen by the popular vote, sends an alternate slate because Donald Trump demands it, of course, we would challenge that action in court. But I hate to rely on the courts, particularly when we have a Supreme Court that is more partisan than it is conservative.
Is there any discussion with you all about the risks associated with not reforming the filibuster so that the Freedom to Vote Act can pass? And I know this is done on the Senate side, but still, these are your Democratic colleagues, because I feel like if anyone could appreciate what's at stake with letting Republicans rig the game and gerrymander their way into the majority with a possible Trump run on the horizon, it's you.
Look, I think we should do away with the filibuster, but at a minimum, there should be a carve out for voting rights, because as you point out, voting rights are fundamental, foundational. And if the foundation is weak or flawed, then the whole edifice on top of it comes crumbling down. If the Republicans were willing to make a carve out of the filibuster so that Mitch McConnell could stack conservative justices on the court, there should be a carve out for voting rights. We cannot allow this archaic mechanism that was used to protect Jim Crow laws in the past to be used once again to protect Jim Crow laws in the future. So I think that's essential. And I think the only pathway is persuading Joe Manchin of the importance of this. And I hope that, taking up voting rights in the Senate and seeing the Republicans are not going to support it will help make the case to Joe Manchin that Republicans will not support this because their whole business model is fewer people voting, and particularly people of color. So I view that as a vital priority for the Democratic Party and for our democracy at large.
Now, in your book, you covered, obviously, the impeachment trial at length. And that was a trial that was marred by most Republicans' loyalty to a criminal president. But still, our institutions were just barely able to hold. But now we're in a position where there's a systematic purging of all the non-MAGA Republicans within the party. So if we just barely held on before, how do we survive with even fewer moderates after 2022? Like, God knows even if Liz Cheney is going to be around 14 months from now.
Well, one of the things that I do in the book is I profile, frankly, the people that have been courageous over this time, because their examples are really important. Some of them we're very familiar with now. They've become almost household names, like Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, like Alexander Vindman. People showed great courage in testifying and defying the president, who called on them to remain silent and participate in his cover-up, if you will. But there were many others, people like Dan Coates, Republican senator of Indiana, became the head of the intelligence community, refused to carry Donald Trump's lies about North Korea, or about Russia, and was willing to risk his job and lost his job because of it. And these are the examples that we need to inspire us. We can't all be Marie Yovanovitch, but we can all figure out in our own lives what we can do to protect our democracy at a time where it's at great risk. But you're right, Donald Trump has been on a 5-year quest to purge any element of dissent within his party, anyone willing to speak out the truth, anyone not willing to carry the big lie. And as long as the Republican Party is this autocratic cult of the former president, this anti-truth cult, they're just going to need to be beaten at the polls. There is no alternative. There's no accommodating an autocratic party. They just need to be beaten at the polls.
And what would you say is the juiciest part of the book?
I think there are a lot of stories that will be of great interest to people. I tell one, for example, of Kevin McCarthy, of sitting next to him on a plane flying back to Washington, D.C. And this was 2010. So this was a preview of things to come. We were talking about the midterms, still 6 months away. And I said, Democrats were going to win. And he said, Republicans were going to win. And it was a total nothing of a conversation. And we get to Washington, we go our separate ways. And little do I know, he goes off and he does a press briefing. And he tells the press that Republicans are going to win the midterms, and everybody knows it. He sat next to Adam Schiff on an airplane, and Adam Schiff admitted Republicans were going to win the midterms. And this comes out the next morning, and I'm just beside myself. And I rush up to him on the House floor, and I said, Kevin, I would have thought if we're having a private conversation, that it was a private conversation. But if it wasn't, you told the press the exact opposite of what I said. And he looks at me and he says, yeah, I know, Adam, but you know how it goes. And I said, no, Kevin, I don't know how it goes. You just make stuff up and that's how you operate, because that's not how I operate. But it is how he operates. And I told that story because people often ask me, do the Republicans really believe what they say in public? What do they say in private? And in private, even the leader of their party will basically admit that he feels completely free to deceive others if it'll help him gain power. And that's why they can never be allowed to govern. A party with that little regard for the truth just cannot be, third in line of succession.
Well, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them,
Yes, yes.
Now, the situation in California is pretty fluid right now. Dianne Feinstein's political future is probably uncertain in the coming years. If you weren't a congressman, is there any other role that would interest you?
I certainly have interest in serving my district, my state, my country. I want to be of use. My father once gave me some very good advice when I was a kid. I write a lot about my dad in the book. He said, if you're good at what you do, there will always be a demand for you. Which was a very liberating idea, because then I just had to try to be good at what I was doing. That's what I intend to continue trying to do, and you could be the judge of whether I'm succeeding or not. But I'm content to let the future take care of itself. And for right now, while our democracy, I think, is hanging by a thread, I know what my mission is.
Well, again, congratulations on the book. That book is Midnight in Washington: How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.